Alrighty, hello students. How are you all doing today? Hope you're doing well. Let me make this big actually. So welcome back to Introduction to Sociology. I'm your professor, Justine Hecht. Call me Professor J, Professor Hecht. Either one is fine. So last week we took at culture and socialization, and we looked at how cultural norms can be informed by the economic structures of society. And then how socialization, our process of learning how to be members of our society, can of course then be informed by those cultural norms that are shaped by the economics of our particular society, right? So this week we're going to look at something called social solidarity, and we're going to be looking at this through the lens of social interaction and human agency. So this is really a topic that's about how does society hold itself together? What are the roles in society and how do they interact with one another, right? And so we're going to look at both Karl Marx's idea about this and Emile Durkheim's idea about this. You're getting two different theoretical perspectives on this particular topic, okay? So let's just go ahead and jump right in. So the first thing I just want you to think about, and this is one of those moments where you should pause the video, and what I recommend is pausing this video and then setting a timer for 1 to 3 minutes and just writing for that full 1 to 3 minutes your response to this question. Are we totally controlled or do we have complete free will? What do you think? And why do you think we're either totally controlled or we have complete free will or some other combination of the two, right? Something like this. But this is the question that's really driving a lot of our conversation today. So pause, spend a few minutes writing. Okay, you're probably back by now, right? Let's kind of, oftentimes when I have this discussion in my classrooms, what kind of comes up is this idea that it's a little bit of both, right? It's a little bit of both. We do have free will, but we also have to navigate our society, right? And so we can decide to jaywalk if we want to, but if there's a police officer nearby, we're taking a risk of getting a ticket, right? And so whether or not that police officer is there might inform whether or not we decide to jaywalk. I know if there's a police officer, I'm definitely not jaywalking. If there's not a police officer and it's completely safe and there's no traffic, I'm absolutely jaywalking, right? So you really start to see how social interactions are shaped by the structures we have to navigate, and the different roles different people play in that particular structure, right? So for example, you might be less willing to cross the street or jaywalk if there is a police officer present because you don't want to get a ticket, right? And so you have the free will to choose to cross the street, right? But the threat of a ticket changes how you engage your free will in that particular case, right? So we call this the relationship between human agency and social structure, right? As sociologists. Oh, I wonder what this looks like for you, because for me, I'm a little box in a corner over here, and some of the text from the slides is obscured by the box, so I hope that you guys can see it still. But anyway, so we're looking at the relationship between human agency and social structure. Human agency, as described here, the definition, are just the way we decide to behave every single day, right? The thoughts and actions that we take to live our daily lives, right? It's the ability for us to think for ourselves and take actions that shape our experiences and our life trajectories, right? And so when you decide, for example, that you're going to go to college to pursue a better degree or to pursue a career or to gain your own personal knowledge, whatever it might be, you're exercising your human agency to decide to go to college, right? You're not being forced. Nobody's compelling you, right? You are deciding this is what I'm going to do. Okay, now human agency, as I was just discussing, also interacts with social structure. So social structures are complex and interconnected sets of social forces, relationships, institutions, etc. that work together to shape thought, behavior, access to choice, access to resources, and overall life experiences. So some examples of social structures that we'll touch on this semester and that sociologists are interested in studying are labor markets and the economy, education, healthcare, family, religion, mass media. There's others that I can't think of off the top of my head right now, but this is a good list to kind of start with. The key thing about a social structure when we're looking at sociology specifically is that a social structure is designed to meet a human need, right? And so, for example, healthcare. The way we have healthcare organized within the United States is through privatized health insurance, right? And so you either have a job that pays for your, that gives you health coverage, right? Or maybe you sign up on what is it called? What is it called? the Affordable Care Act structure, right? That enables people to purchase some level of insurance from the federal government. Maybe you have, in Arizona, it would be called Access. This is Medicare or Medicaid, right? That is, and provides some funding for health insurance for low income people, so on and so forth, right? And so the purpose of that institution is to ensure a healthy population, right? And a healthy group of people, essentially. The way that institution is organized is going to influence what kind of access to healthcare people actually have here, right? So a good example of this is the difference between healthcare in somewhere like Germany or somewhere like the United States. Germany has universal healthcare. If somebody in Germany is injured and has to call an ambulance, that ambulance comes, picks them up, takes them to the hospital, they get treated. No bill arrives afterwards, right? All of that stuff is paid for and included within their taxes within the country of Germany. In the United States, on the other hand, if you fall down, get hurt, a lot of times people are hesitant to call an ambulance because they're not sure if their insurance is going to cover it, or maybe they don't have insurance and they know that they won't be able to afford the bill that comes as a result of that, right? And so the purpose of those social structures in both societies is to serve public health, right? The way those structures are organized is going to shape the kind of access people have to their health systems in one way or the other, right? Okay, so when we're thinking about this interaction between human agency and social structure, if you said it's a combination of both, you're absolutely right, right? We decide how we navigate these structures, but these structures inform what kind of decisions we have access to in the first place, okay? Another couple of concepts that we need to know about for this week, right, are social order and the labor market. That's going to be a key one that we're looking into. So social order is the degree of stability, order, and cohesion in a society, the way social groups and institutions are organized in society. So how well are these institutions working together? Are they fulfilling their stated purpose, right? What kind of different roles do people play in that society, and how are those roles valued or not valued in any given society? Remember, this is an intro course, and so I'm giving you broad frameworks, right? If you are very interested in this, keep taking sociology classes, take some anthropology classes, some history classes. This kind of stuff will continue to dive into these topics in more depth, right? But we can think about two broad ways to organize society. There's obviously a combination of these as well, right? But social order can, generally speaking, be hierarchical, like this slide over here with this, it's got, I don't know how well you guys can see it, but it's got like a bag of money on top, and then different people in different positions, all within the society. And so here we have workers, here we have like the middle class, this appears to be the military, this is probably like the church, and then this would be the government, right? And then the banking system at the top here. So this is, an example or an illustration of how society is organized within a capitalist system, essentially, right? So workers at the bottom, the middle class in the middle, the military have maybe a higher position than the middle class, the clergy, I think that's who this is in the middle, or in this role here, right? And then the business owners at the top, essentially, right? And so when we have a hierarchical society, generally it's the people at the top that are seen to be as the most important to social order and can contribute the most value to social order. And social stability and cohesion, and the people at the bottom generally are seen as being kind of the least valuable or not contributing as much to the social order, right? Typically the folks, the higher up you get in a hierarchy, the more power to make decisions and shape outcomes you're going to have. People at the bottom of these hierarchical societies often have very little decision-making power. So that's one way to organize society. Another way to organize society could be through non-hierarchical leadership models. This is sometimes called horizontalism or consensus or participatory democracy, something like this, right? Sometimes it could be a confederation. It just kind of depends on the historical time period and the institution we're talking about. It could be a nation, it could be a nonprofit organization. It just kind of depends, right? But here what you can see is that there's not a hierarchy, right? It's everybody's kind of on the same page here. And each circle here represents a different aspect of society, right? And you can see that they overlap. And so the idea here is that all of the roles people play in society, whether they be the workers or they be the business owners, are equally important to that society. And so all of these roles are going to have some decision-making power in shaping that society in one way or the other. And so this model really tries to even the playing field, right? And give people who might not have a ton of power in this, in the hierarchical model, right, more access to decision-making power, essentially. A good example of this is the Iroquois Society. I'm very thirsty, sorry, is the Iroquois Society that was some of the first indigenous people that Europeans came into contact with when they landed in the New World. The Iroquois Society would have been in the, and still continues to exist, in the northeastern portion of the United States, right? So, hold on just a sec, sorry. Okay, right. In this society, right, it's a confederation of 5 different indigenous communities. And in this society, how their decision-making structure worked was much more along this non-hierarchical leadership model. And so in their societies, again, very broadly speaking, men tended to go out and do the hunting and manage the warfare, and women tended to do the domestic labor, right? Raise the children, prepare the food, so on and so forth, those kind of things, right? Now in the society, though, it was understood that somebody needs to go out and protect our territories, right? And to hunt for food and so on and so forth. And somebody also needs to stay home and make sure the kids are taken care of and that we're raising children for our next generation, right? Both of these roles are equally important. And this shows up in their decision-making process, right? So what they would do to make decisions about, any major thing that would impact their communities is that they would organize their decision-making processes into a circle. In the middle of that circle would be the men, who are often the chiefs of their particular community, talking about, trade, talking about relationships with other tribes, right? Talking about what their communities needed and how they were going to get it done, right? And then outside of that circle would be the women, and they would be just around, they would literally circle around the men in the middle making these particular decisions. If the women thought that the men were making a bad decision, they could disband that group of men, right? And then start making those decisions themselves, essentially, right? There's process here and how that all works, right? But what we see here is shared decision making that's actually happening, right? Where it's not just the chiefs who are making the decisions. The chiefs are accountable to the rest of the tribe, who are represented by the women in this tribe, right? And if they're not being accountable to the tribe, then they can immediately be voted voted out, essentially, right? And then women would take over in these particular instances to finalize decisions that were central to the community in one way or the other. And so this means that it's not that men have more power in society or that women have more power in society, is that they're sharing power, right? So that we can, the focus can be on what is best for the community at large, right? And so we can think about what's the difference in a society that's organized around sharing power versus a society that's organized around where the assumption is that people at the top have power and people at the bottom do not, right? Okay, so that's enough of that. So there's two broad frameworks for how we can think about how we maintain either of these types of social orders, right? Now, the United States does not have a non-hierarchical leadership model. We very much have a hierarchical society, right? And so we're going to be looking at this through the lens of the United States specifically, okay? So remember, for functional, we're looking at functionalism and conflict theory. Functionalism is Emile Durkheim, and he, we remember from 2 weeks ago, that functionalism is a sociological theory that argues that each social structure is designed to maintain social stability and to maintain social order. It should contribute to society all the different social institutions acting in harmony with one another so that no radical changes are necessary, right? Change happens slowly over time through small, minute changes to the system that are shaped by changes in human need, essentially, right? Even though the functionalists do see society as a living organism in which each part plays a role, right? They also understand that social forces exist outside of the individual and must be considered here, right? And so Emile Durkheim came up with these ideas of mechanical solidarity and organic solidarity. And he's looking at, well, how are societies staying together? How do they have shared values, and how do those shared values ensure that the society is cohesive, that people know what their roles are, so on and so forth, right? And so he says that as we move from pre-industrial societies to industrial societies, the type of solidarity, the type of relationships that keep society together start to change, right? So in pre-industrial societies, he said that society is less complex typically, and that because of this, society tends to be maintained through the collective consciousness of a culture. People do things the way that they've done them because they've always done things that way. There's not a lot of difference in the division of labor. So he's really focusing here on pre-industrial and pre-modern groups, right? He's basically saying that, you know, if you're born into the Iroquois society, for example, right, there's very specific roles that everybody plays. If your mom was, you know, the town medicine person, right, then that is likely to be your role when you age as well, right? And so there's not a ton of choice, but it's very clear what your path is going to be in this case, right? And so there's the communities tend to be smaller, so it's easier to have a shared set of values, so on and so forth. And so people stay together and continue to maintain their various social roles because that's just the way things have always been done. Society is not too complex. We don't necessarily need a ton of different roles, right? We know what direction we're going in. We know what our role is going to be, and so we're just naturally going to fulfill that. And then he also talks about this idea of organic solidarity that develops in what he says in post-industrial societies and then capitalist societies, is that he argues that this type of solidarity is rooted in the acceptance of economic and social differences, and that under capitalism, labor becomes so specialized, right, that it enables people to cooperate across differences here, right? And so, for example, if we're working in a factory, right, there is going to be the foreman, who is kind of the supervisor of the factory floor, right? And then there's going to be the workers. Maybe one worker's job is to make the loop for the top of the water bottle here, right? And then the other worker's job is to make the lid that the loop will attach onto for the top of the water bottle here, right? And so the foreman is working cooperatively with the workers to make sure that they are moving along, making the required materials for the water bottle lid here, right? Whatever it is, right? And then those workers, they're doing two different tasks. One is making the loop, one is making the lid itself, right? And then probably there'd be a third worker to attach the loop to the lid, right? And so they're all doing a different task, and somebody might not know how to make the loop, but they do know how to make the lid. And so they need to work with the loop maker to make the final project, essentially, right? And so capitalism creates such specialized differentiation in labor that it allows people to actually work together across their different experiences, right? So this is a broad overview for you. You do have a video about this mechanical solidarity, organic solidarity, that I highly recommend that you watch to help prepare you for this week's discussion board, right? And so for the key things for Durkheim here, right, is that as we move from mechanical solidarity to organic solidarity, society gets more complex, there's more difference, but for the need to maintain society, that difference enables cooperation for the overall benefit of society. That's the key thing we should take away for organic solidarity. Okay, so let me move on. Then the other position here is the conflict theory position, right? And so this is coming out of Karl Marx and his ideas about alienation in society. Right. And so he would acknowledge like the differences of the difference in labor and the way in which capitalism requires different types of labor specialization and all of this, right? But whereas Durkheim sees this as a tool that's fostering social stability, Marx sees this as a process that is maintaining social inequality here, right? And so for him, the division of labor doesn't create cooperation. It contributes to social inequality and the exploitation of workers specifically, right? And so he comes up with this idea of alienation, and he defines it as the condition of isolation, dehumanization, and disenchanting effects of laboring under capitalism. The individual becomes isolated from society, their labor, and themselves, right? And thus isolated from their sense of their own humanity in so many ways, right? And so he identifies four processes. Let me see what I have here. Yeah, okay, so he identifies four processes of alienation, and I'll talk about those in just a second here. But if you can, take a look at this political cartoon here, right? And so, you know, again, if I'm in person, I ask students what they see here, right? And then we go through it together in one way or the other. But what you might notice is that there's this dude, right? He's wearing like a top hat. he's on the bigger side, right? He's wearing some kind of suit situation. His mouth is opened, almost like a conveyor belt. His tongue appears to be the conveyor belt, actually. And then we see workers going into his mouth, right? And then coming out the other side, also on a conveyor belt in coffins here, essentially, right? And so I want you to notice, what do you notice about the workers? Can you tell these workers apart, or do they all look the same? I'm assuming you probably answered they all look the same, right? And so here, what this really is showing us is this idea that of isolation and dehumanization. The worker here has no individual personality, no individual self-expression, right? They're only being portrayed as workers and then being fed into presumably one of the capitalists in this case, right? They go into the capitalist. They clearly are feeding him because he's quite large here, right? But they come out as dead shells of themselves, essentially, right? Because they spend so much time working for the capitalist class that they have no time to express themselves or to engage in social relationships, right? To be their true individual selves in one way or the other. So this is an important point because oftentimes when we're thinking about Karl Marx and we're thinking about his critiques of capitalism and his development of the theory of communism, right, we often often have this perception that communism and Marx in particular, particularly Marx, I'm not so worried about communism. Take a political theory course, right? But, right, particularly Marx wants to make everybody the same, right? He wants to make everybody the same and everybody have all the same things here, right? But when we actually start getting into his theories and reading it for ourselves, right, we start to see that his argument is actually that capitalism makes everybody the same and denies people their individuality, and it's because they're positioned solely as workers, essentially, right? And so Marx really starts to become a lot more concerned with human freedom than he does standard equality, essentially, right? So let's break down these different types of alienation. And again, there is also going to be I'm actually not going to spend a ton of time on this because I want this video to be a little bit shorter and I want to get to some of the other stuff instead. But the 4 types are alienation from the product of labor. So you have no control over how that product is being produced. You can't change it creatively, right? If you see a better way to work it, you're not able to do that because the boss or the supervisor or the owner of the company, right, is determining how that should happen, right? So no control over what you actually produce and what it can be used for. There's also then the alienation of the process of one's labor, where the way that you do your work is directed by somebody else. Think of the micromanaging manager you've had at some point in time, right? So you know that I'm going to go into my work, and if I do my job in this way, it's going to get done. It's going to get done well. It's great, right? But a manager comes in, maybe they're a new manager, and they see you doing it in a way that's different from them, right? And they might say, hey, you have to do it this way, even though you know the way the manager is saying, right, isn't actually going to work. So no control over how you actually design your own labor. Work can be really repetitive, creatively unrewarding, so on and so forth, right? And so also alienation from others, whereas the system puts workers into competition with themselves, with each other, rather than into a space of cooperation, which again is very different from Durkheim's position. And it prevents workers from seeing their shared interest. Marx calls this false consciousness, which is a way of thinking that prevents a person from seeing the true nature of their economic situation. So for Marx, what he would argue here, right, it's not your individual worker who's trying to get that, coveted supervisor position that's the actual problem, right? It's the people who own the factory and the capitalist class, right, that are denying you meaningful wages to cover your cost of living, right? And they're the people we actually need to go after if we want to change our economic situation. He says basically when we blame each other and our fellow workers, this is a false understanding of where the true cause of our problems actually lies. And then finally he says we have alienation from oneself, where the demands that are placed upon workers to work so much that to pay for their basic needs for life, right, is converted from a person into an object that is replaceable in the system of production. Think about if you quit your job, they fill somebody else in there pretty quickly, right? But then also you spend all of your time working, so you're not able to pursue the things that you actually care about, the things that are actually that you're actually passionate about. Okay, so there's another video on this. I highly recommend watching that in more depth as well. And so then I want us to think about this in relationship to child labor, because I'm going to have you read an article this week about in the state of either Iowa or Idaho, I always forget, right, they were proposing a law that would allow them to lower the age by which people can serve alcohol from 21 to 18 or 19, and in some cases younger than that. This law was proposed over a couple of different states, right? So there is this video about child labor in the learning materials this week. I highly recommend you watch that. We're not going to watch it together here because that will be silly, right? But, right, watch this just so you have a sense of some of the different positionalities that are coming up around child labor in the United States. And again, this is in this module's learning materials, okay? So let's think about some of these. No, I don't want to watch that right now. My goodness. There we go, right? So if we're talking about the relationship between social structure and human agency and how society holds together, right, we are looking at, do the social structures that hold society together, do they maintain social stability and social order, or are they being used to maintain social inequality, essentially, right? So we're looking at this through the lens of child labor and restaurant industries within the United States in our current era. I want to give you just a little bit of history about how child labor laws came into being in the first place, so you have that historical context, right? So what you're looking at here is a picture of the textile strike in Philadelphia and the march to Oyster Bay to meet Theodore Roosevelt, right? And so that was organized by this woman right here named Mary Harris Mother Jones. She was a Irish immigrant to the United States. She had several children, and she saw all of them die through various diseases. Her husband also died from his work in, I think it was a mine, if I remember correctly off the top of my head, right? And so as her children die and her husband dies, right, she really becomes a key icon and leader in the labor movement within the United States in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Right, and so she was very concerned about the conditions of young children who were working in factories during this time period, right? It was very common for children to work in factories, particularly children of working class families. And she was noticing that these children are going to work in very unsafe working conditions. Many of them would go work in the factories and they would come out with missing limbs, right? Eye injuries, starting to develop like lung issues by working in the mines, these kind of different things, right? And she really wanted to draw attention to this because she didn't think what was happening to children was right. And as you can see here, right, on their signs and one of the protests that they were a part of, right, it says, "We want to go to school. More school, less hospitals." Right, and then, this idea over here, we want time to go to school and we want time to play, right? And so what Jones was really getting at here, and what these young folks are getting at here, right, is that when we have to work so much, right, we don't have time to go to school and educate ourselves, and we don't have time to play and just be children and explore our imaginations as well, right? And of course, more school, less hospitals really is speaking to this point, is that when we go to work, we get hurt, right? Why are we getting hurt and having to go to the hospital when we could just be going to school and learning, whatever we need to learn to be beneficial to our society, right? And so many of the newspapers during this time period wouldn't cover the labor organizing that was going around children's rights when it came to labor rights in the United States, right? And so some of the newspapers in Philadelphia, in particular, where this textile strike happens, didn't want to run these stories because the newspaper company itself was owned by the same people who owned the textile factory, right? And so they were concerned if they published something against the fabric factories, right, that they might lose funding or be punished by the textile factory in one way or the other, right? And so Mother Mary Jones says, well, I've got stock in these children and I'll arrange a little publicity, right? If the newspapers won't cover it, I'm going to create a spectacle to make folks cover it, essentially, right? And so we see in 1903 in Philadelphia, there is a strike of 75,000 workers. So what this means is 75,000 workers refused to go to work. for a period of time so that they could get their demands met. Of those workers on strike, 10,000 of them were children, right? And so her whole idea here is that we're going to lead these children from Philadelphia to Oyster Bay to meet with President Theodore Roosevelt, right? This is a pretty long march. It takes a couple of days, right? When they get there, Roosevelt doesn't meet with them, right? But they do have a rally and talk about the importance of children having the ability to go to school, to go and play, right? And not have to work. So this march really becomes kind of the first piece of social processes that lead to the creation of child labor laws that prevent children from working in unsafe conditions in the first place, right? So we can see this leads to something called the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938, which prohibited employment of oppressive child labor, made it so that the minimum age of non-agricultural labor was 16, so you couldn't work if you were younger than 16 in non-agricultural labor. Anyone under 18 was prohibited from dangerous jobs. Restricted work hours for 14 and 15-year-olds so that you're not working 16-hour days anymore, or even 8-hour days. Maybe you're working 4 or 5-hour days, right? It reduced the number of children working in factories and increased school attendance. And it didn't eliminate child labor in agriculture or family businesses, which tend to be rural and migrant communities in particular. And so you can see over here, right, the number of child workers by various sectors. And so you can see that the largest portion actually is agriculture, followed by manufacturing. And then we have administration, occupation, the trades, domestic helpers, transportation, and other, right? And so we can see even when we did start implementing these fair standard labor practices in the 1930s here, right, many of them excluded agricultural labor specifically. So it didn't necessarily meet the needs of all children workers, but a good portion of them nonetheless, right? So just so you can kind of see what that actually looks like. Okay, let me see. Okay, yes. So now that we have some of this kind of history here, right, is that child labor laws were made possible through the organizing work of folks like Mother Jones, right, and the children that she organized, and then the labor movement as a whole, which led to the establishment of the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act. And so now, if we're in this situation where we are seeing that restaurant industries in particular are looking to lower the age by which people can serve alcohol, right? We want to start thinking about why. Why are we having these conversations about things that are related to child labor? What is going on in our social structure that is making that seem like something that's appealing again, right? And so we need, again, some more context about what led to these particular changes. And the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic, had a huge impact on the restaurant industry specifically. And so you can see here, their sales were $240 billion less than expected. When 2020 ended, there were 2.5 million fewer jobs in the hospitality and service industries. And up to 8 million workers had been laid off, right? So up to 8 million workers had been laid off as a result of the pandemic in the restaurant and hospitality industries. 62% were in fine dining, 54% in family casual dining. Restaurants had been reporting that their staffing was 20% below normal, and nearly 2 million fewer 16 to 34-year-olds in the restaurant industry. When workers chose to leave voluntarily, or maybe they did get laid off and then decided not to come back, right? We find that 1/3 of these workers did not return. Again, either they chose to leave voluntarily or they were laid off and they're like, I'm not going back, I'm good, right? The reasons that they gave for this is that they were seeking higher pay, better benefits, greater respect, and safer working conditions. Particularly for restaurant and hospitality workers, some of the things that they faced during the pandemic were issues around being asked to wear a mask in public spaces, there's many reports of this. You can definitely read about it, right? But service workers in the restaurant industry in particular often faced like being spit on if they were asked to, if they asked somebody to put a mask on, or coughed in their face during like a pandemic, right? And so these were some of the safety issues that they were concerned about, right? And of course, respect issues. Service work notoriously doesn't have the greatest benefits. Sometimes health insurance is provided, sometimes it's not, right? And service work, generally speaking, does rely on tips, right? And so the income isn't steady. And even like hospitality work can be pretty low wages as well, right? So these are the reasons that they said for leaving. And this is how the restaurant industry as a whole and the hospitality industry as a whole found themselves in need of workers, essentially, right? Absolutely found themselves in need of workers. Oh, I thought I had more here. No, I don't. Okay, great. So, perfect. Good. I don't want to go on too much longer because this is already pretty long for you guys, but this is the information that you're going to need to help you think through the relationship between social interaction and human agency and the idea of social solidarity this month or this week, right? So you're going to read an article about the lowering the age by which workers can serve alcohol at restaurant industries. This information on this slide particularly is going to help you with this. You're also going to be asked to reflect on your own experiences of work or school and thinking through the experiences of alienation. And yeah, you'll have to decide if Marx or Durkheim better explains the conditions in the restaurant industry at this point in time. All right, so that's what we got. If you have any questions, reach out. I'm always here for you. Otherwise, I will see you next time. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.